Welcome to our Leadership Dialogues, where we focus on reimagining financial services. We have been exploring topics around reinvigorating payments, refreshing customer journeys, and rethinking the ecosystem. Today, we continue to discuss how organizations can remain competitive and innovate by harnessing the broader ecosystem. More specifically, we will talk about how industry-wide utilities around data management and workflow solutions can help to reduce risk and improve the efficiency of end-to-end trade processes by offering market standards around these. My name is Lucine Tertullian, partner in Baringa's Capital Markets Consulting practice, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Roy Sadden, who's the CEO and co-founder of Access Fintech. Welcome, Roy. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Roy, perhaps you could start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and also Access Fintech.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to borrow quite a few words from your brief introduction. You spoke about ecosystem, you spoke about evolution, which kind of is the core of Access Fintech. So we set up Access Fintech to try and introduce efficiencies in the marketplace, but specifically focus on efficiencies when one bank is dependent on the other, whether it's a partner, a competitor, but someone on the supply chain to actually improve. So we're trying to harness all that space that sits between organization and to unlock massive efficiencies that are captive and locked in there, but can only be addressed if we create something that allows collaboration. And the keywords for what we've done is use data as a collaboration vehicle to improve the entire supply chain. That's what we've done. And we'll talk more about it later. We'll talk about the concept of a shared data lake, but kind of these are the basic aspects of what we're doing. A bit about me. I guess lifelong entrepreneur. I was one of the founders of a company called Triana back in 2000. I think enough time passed after we sold Triana that I forgot how hard it is to start a company. So come 2016, I said, oh, why don't we do that one again? It should be second time easier. So it's definitely a second time easier, but it just reminded me of kind of the journey you have as a startup, the full commitment you have to the journey, to the ecosystem to really see it through. So I'm very excited about where we are, but definitely always been on the technology and the innovation, trying to help the financial ecosystem.
Great. Well, welcome again. Thank you. So I suppose if we reflect on the market context a little bit more, as the financial services industry continues to address new regulations, heightened competition, and of course, the volatility and the challenges of the recent year, as you've mentioned, institutions remain focused on delivering efficiency improvements and enhancing their technology platforms. Yeah. However, this fragmented data, partial data, manual processes that arise from legacy systems mean increased costs and liquidity risk. And at the same time, firms are constantly looking to modernize their internal processes and systems, which is complex and expensive. Yeah. You mentioned that Access Fintech was born out of a data distribution challenge. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you are working with banks across the industry to help create these shared solutions?
There's a few things that have kind of, when you start a company, a lot of it is about the idea and the vision, but a lot of it is also around the evolution of the marketplace around you and when the mindset of the ecosystem is. You mentioned around banks evolving. You go back from 2000 to now, proprietary trading gone, heightened regulation increased, competition from non-traditional banks and a lot of the cloud companies coming in. The ecosystem has really changed. Mm-hmm. Regulation is a two-edged sword. It's very expensive, but it's also a bit of a protective and a barrier to prevent the territory of the incumbents. So depending how you look at it and how you embrace it, but you have to do it right or you get penalized heavily for it. So when we came into the ecosystem, we saw an environment that agreed it needed to change and wanted to change. I call the first wave the fintech 1.0. The first wave was the wave that really was very much about disrupting the banking environment. We can do it better. A more mature and slightly more humble fintech 2.0 was, well, the banks have a lot of clients, they have infrastructure, they adhere to regulation, but they want to change. How do we actually facilitate that evolution? So we came into this ecosystem working with banks and trying to identify what it is that we can challenge to make it better. And as I said, we focused on the places where banks saw opportunity to evolve, but they felt like they didn't control the execution of it because they're dependent on others in the supply chain, an executing broker on a prime broker on a custodian on infrastructure. If one of the steps along the chain, the value chain, doesn't improve, it impacts the entire ecosystem. Now, our world of finance is very interesting because I could be an executing broker one day and a custodian the other day. So I could be working with my competitors/providers in the same time. So we really focused on the places where it was a clear benefit for the full supply chain without eroding the differentiators. And there's lots of challenges along that ecosystem because we all do banking services such as settlements, such as payments, such as risk management, such as onboarding that aren't necessarily differentiating, again, dependent on others. And if we can do it better, the whole supply chain improves out of it. So that's what we came out of. But we didn't know to make that statement when we started. When we started, the focus was around exceptions. Exceptions are expensive. They take a long time to fix. They have an impact on the balance sheet because they carry penalties and they carry locked up capital. How do we just fix the world of exceptions, which is 3 to 5% of the workflow? If I can make that better, I've contributed myself. The evolution took us beyond that into what it's not just about exceptions, it's about preventing exceptions, it's about identifying exceptions, it's about creating efficiencies. But our journey definitely started with a more humble beginnings of how do I make the exception lifecycle, which is very human intensive and capital intensive, more efficient, and evolved from there as we understood better the infrastructure in the banks and understood better the dependencies the banks have on each other. I think I gave you a very long answer to a very simple question.
No, it's very helpful. I suppose what we're highlighting here as well is there are common challenges that a lot of banks face. Exceptions is one, as you mentioned. Data fragmentation is another one. But I suppose what we're trying to say is, why is it better for banks to try and address these within a sort of a utility across the industry rather than everyone trying to do this on their own? I guess if you could elaborate what you've seen and why it's better to just sort of address this across the industry.
I'll take the simple activity of let's take an equity transaction. And what we're talking about doesn't matter if it's a trade in a specific asset, if it's an asset servicing function, if it's a margin activity. I, as an asset manager, will trade through my executing broker and clear through my custodian and be dependent on all the market infrastructure to work. That means that on the back of every client servicing activity, there's at least one, if no more, interbank transactions. And if I take into account allocations, there are actually many interbank transactions on the back of it. When is an interbank transaction? It means if one side executes well and the other one doesn't, this transaction is failing and the client is not serviced well. And both functions have a interest in having the client be hands-free. If there is a problem, get to the point where the client can self-service and fix it. But I can only do that if I have a correlated view across the entire supply chain to do that. So the executive broker and the custodian have a vested interest in making it easier for either one to identify the problem, for either one to highlight to the client should they be part of the resolution cycle, and get to the point where the client self-services. There's so much triaging that happens today and so much chasing of data because as a party to the transaction, I only know what's in my system. And banking systems have always been built to store what I know, not what the industry knows about its trade. So now I need to know what my counterparty knows. I need to verify what my client knows. And I'm managing it all in kind of offline activities because I don't have anywhere to store that data. And if something changes after my phone call, my email, my chat, I'm already out of sync with it. So you really want to create a footprint of that transaction or lineage of the transaction that constantly updates from all the contributors, such that if I want to jump in and make a decision, or if better than that, the system can tell me there will be a problem with this trade in 2 days' time. We're giving you the heads up right now. I have all the data at my fingertips. So the one thing is access to data. The second thing is collaboration. Maybe I've identified it, but I don't fix it. My counterparty has. Can I task them or assign to them a responsibility or highlight to them based on the collected data what the responsibility lies, and ultimately give transparency to my buy side? So the idea was really to create a much more efficient ecosystem. One of the initial points was really try to get to the point of client self-servicing. If I think about my modern retail world, whether it's retail banking or whether it's retail shopping, I really have all the information, no matter who my provider is. I look at Amazon, right? It doesn't matter who my provider is. I have the full life cycle of the transaction, from the delivery, first of all, from the shopping experience to tracking it, to the delivery, to managing the dispute if there is any. And I can rely on the client to self-service because he's got one way of addressing it. We grew up in an environment that every bank was investing in its own portal. And for me, the buy side, the ability to self-service was almost impossible. Everyone was interacting differently. the decision by the banks that there is a benefit in creating a mutual client servicing portal with the goal and the ultimate goal to get the clients to actually feel comfortable to self-service because we've normalized the activities for them is really paying dividends now. Clients want to self-service. They just need a simple process to do that and not a bespoke one per relationship. So the banks were ready for that kind of statement. The buy side were ready for that kind of statement. We just happened to be in the right time to create that neutral ecosystem so clients can self-service. So that was one example of what you do when you really are happy to collaborate on data. And then everything that we spoke about, also improving the workflow, is the secondary effect of that.
Yeah, and it's about creating sort of that single version of the truth, right? As far as that trade status is, versus each individual organization having their own version of it, and the thousands of emails that I exchange between counterparties to get to the truth. It's about creating that one single source of the truth and eliminating that effort around getting to that view.
It's funny what you lose efficiency on, right? Even if the data is accurate, but every bank has got a different status to reflect that specific activity. I just can't write a single query across the industry and say, show me all the things that have this kind of problem right now, because it's a terminology, it's a language, it's vocabulary. So you have to invest not just in collecting data, you have to invest a lot in cleansing data. You have to invest a lot in creating the metadata to allow me to look at it through a single lens, but without having the banks to change the way they behave. The critical thing is if I'm asking the banks to change, lose their identity, lose the differentiator for the sake of cleansed data, that's almost an impossible task. You have to create a real value add in indexing and normalizing the data such that by the time the client sees it, he does see a normalized ecosystem, but the impact isn't a massive transformation for the bank. It's much more about data availability than a change. And there's a lot of roles to be played in that activity, right? And the relationships we have with the consulting and the advisory firms are about how do you help the banks do that in a focused way such that it's not an invasive process, but the rewards you reap are dramatic when you go through a shared platform.
Yeah. And can I ask, with things like CSDR, for example, have you seen greater appetite for banks to collaborate around some of this?
Yeah, totally. I mean, CSDR listen, it's a tax, right? It's a way of improving the efficiency through a fine system. It's a very clear, well-defined. I don't think it always necessarily makes the most sense, but it's very clear what's being asked to do. I don't think that if a bank addresses CSDR better, he necessarily wins mandates. If he addresses it poorly, he'll definitely lose mandates. If he's able, or if they are able to prevent fails, it will reward them. But to prevent fails, I need to work in collaboration. Again, I don't own the fail, it's always a handshake. So I need to work with the others so we can all improve it. If I talk about addressing it, the amount of effort and capital required to solve the problem by yourself is massive. And again, there's not much return on it. If I can do it in a collaborative shared cost perspective, then I get the collective knowledge of making sure I get it right, because all the banks contribute their knowledge into getting a solution out there. So I remove some risk out of it. I get the collective focus that it's not my IT resources and the next bank's IT resources. It's actually pooling some of it in order to share the activity. So I take the delivery risk out of it. So did I get it right? Am I on time? There's so many components on a non-differentiating. It kind of price for that kind of solution. And specifically CSDR, it's all about passing actions between firms. So you go back to collaboration. I don't just fix it. I now need to interact with the others as part of that remedy. It goes back to, well, if I had a shared workflow on top of shared data, it's kind of custom made for CSDR. It was like a classic example of how new cloud infrastructure can help you take a lot of risk, time, predictability out of this exercise.
Absolutely. We talked a bit about risk reduction. If I sort of focus a bit around cost reduction and efficiency, these are key topics that have been around for years, if not decades. And I think very few organizations have really been able to deliver sustainable cost optimization. How do you see some of Access FinTech products really helping, and the shared infrastructure solutions that you've created helping with this objective?
So again, the focus that we had was focusing on what does cloud mean to the banks? And for us, cloud meant sharing. It wasn't just moving my infrastructure to the cloud. It's cheaper. It's understanding what it is, that I now have a shared infrastructure and I can work on data entitlements, data availability, shared workflow. But even that, there were lots of attempts, and you go through time where banks try to create shared infrastructure, and there's very few cases of success. And for us, the reason why I didn't succeed, it was trying to do too much. They were trying to solve operational and data and technology and governance and create an entity and contribute technology, and it was too much. And we focused specifically on data. We said, if we solve this layer, which is fundamental, on top of that, the banks or service providers can take on the challenge of improving operational efficiency or improving the technology stack. But if we are able to decompose the data from as just one layer of focus, so that's what we focused on and said, okay, if we have to be successful on that, and data lent itself to collaboration, but it was still about the data. How do I collaborate on the data? And then around it grew an ecosystem, because banks who want to onboard technologies, it's often about furnishing data to that provider. And they said, well, if I'm already kind of cleansing and working in a collaborative manner, why can't I just entitle the data from here to new technologies rather than onboard them onto my stack? It's a lot cheaper, and the cloud will onboard technology. So still around data, we started enabling an ecosystem. So it was data, collaboration, ecosystem. So these were steps that were successive to each other, but they led you on a journey that wasn't, the goal, the initial goal was very focused. Even within data, we only started with exceptions. And it's not like I can say in hindsight we were smart enough to do it. That's all the vision we had at the time. That kind of grew, but you start with a focused enough problem, you have a high chance of succeeding in solving that activity. But we also drew very clear boundaries. I'm not the golden source of the industry. The bank owns the data. Data is the new asset. Banks don't want to give it up. We're not in that business of taking it away. We had to create the window shopping infrastructure to doing that. But if you move the users away, suddenly it gives the technology at the bank the ability to make decisions about decommissioning system at a completely different pace and a completely different pressure structure. Because I've already kind of created a data environment which is better than my internal data because it's blended with the other banks. So that's my users are. So I'm giving them a better place to live in. My golden source and my operating systems are internal, but now if I want to upgrade, it's an internal decision of a microservice rather than completely moving a whole user base over to the other side. So it freed up a lot of resistance points within the banks. So when we talk about the sustainability of benefits, you can layer more and more benefits once you've really solved the data challenge. And we wanted to solve the data challenge, not in a single bank ecosystem, but in a multiple, to make the data better than what a single bank has. That made it attractive. So that starts a snowball effect. And that snowball is we see it evolving all the time. It continues to evolve with what benefits the banks can reap out of this.
Sure. And you mentioned the sort of the access fintech industry data lake. Is that can you tell us, just elaborate a little bit about how that approach is different? The approach that you've taken is different to how others have approached it.
Yeah. So you really have to treat data as something that has to be controlled to the nth degree. What we've done is created an environment that every bank has its own tenant in the data lake, and they have a dial. And in that dial, they can decide how much they share and when they share and who they share it with. So what do I share with my client versus what do I share with my counterpart? How long does it stay shared for? So you create that data management layer. The data management layer is one thing. Defining the data dictionary. So not asking to invent a brand new protocol, but defining what data is required for you to work in parallel with your peers, and defining those shared workflows was the second activity. So we focused on creating the data management layers such that banks are comfortable that they have the full control that they have, that we guarantee to them that what they do is going to be reciprocated by the other banks in the buy side. So they're in a trusted environment. Again, trust is going to be following us the whole time. And then highlighting to them how this blended data will come back and show them a prioritized set of activities to do. So the reciprocation is not just seeing other people's data, it's the network will come back and highlight to you where your focus areas should be based on what your book of work is, based on what the book of work of the industry is. So it's all about data, but the fundamentals was data governance, data management, data control. That's what we focus. It wasn't finance at all. It's understanding how you manage data and then utilizing it in a financial ecosystem, and not the other way around of solving a financial problem and then figuring out the data.
Yeah, data governance. I think so many banks, organisations will have a data governance program. It's such a tough one to crack, given the complexity of it all. Roy, thank you. And my last question really is around, how do you select bank partners? You already work with some of the sort of the big names on the street, but what do you look for, and what do you think creates a successful partnership and effective collaboration in your view?
Loaded question. It depends on the. So we were a startup. Well, we're not a startup anymore because we're really becoming part of the infrastructure. But it's a different question at different stages in life. When you're a startup, you're almost looking for, well, not almost, you're looking for the bank who will have a 3 to 5 year horizon, and are not necessarily focused on the 12-month return, which most of the bank projects are, but actually saying there is a data or a strategy which drives what we're doing, and this fulfills the strategy. So we were lucky enough to be at both the JP Morgan and the City Incubator. We were lucky enough to be in the growth program for Goldman Sachs. It addressed a strategic direction that they wanted to take the firm. So that was really important to make sure that, because a lot of firms, I call them the stage 2, you go back to crossing the chasm. There's plenty of late adopters and followers who will come in once it's proven the value. When we were young, we wanted people who, firms who had a vision that was more than 12 months and understood it. And when we did our Series A, the banks actually came to us and said, it will take you longer to execute, and it will take you even longer to get the banks to change behavior. We will write you a check that will give you runway to execute on the long term, on 3-year horizon, which was crucial for what we did. Now, I'd like to think that it's less about picking partners and rather the banks picking us. Right? We are a network. There's gravitas to the network. When it gets enough credibility and enough momentum, you're on the other way around. So that's about making sure that we grow our processes and our standards to leave that shell of a startup and actually be the trusted partner that the banks need. So this is really kind of the butterfly story, right? You get the cocoon and then you come out and then you're meant to be this. So we're ready to spread our wings and be this beautiful butterfly.
Yeah. Great story. Roy, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us.
No, a pleasure, and thank you for the platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Join us for future sessions where we'll be discussing other examples and case studies of bringing ecosystem partnerships to life. Thank you.